Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes you just can't seem to adjust your behavior even when you know you should? This new study dives into that very question, exploring the tricky relationship between learning and making those crucial adjustments in our thinking. These researchers were really curious about how we learn to control our actions, especially when things get a bit messy or predictable. We know that our brains can learn to get better at tasks with practice, and they can also learn to expect certain things to happen. For example, if you are always asked to sort red things into one box and blue things into another, you learn to quickly react to colors. But what happens when the difficulty of the task itself is predictable? Can we learn to prepare ourselves before a difficult situation even arrives? That is the big puzzle they wanted to crack. Think of cognitive control as your brain's built-in manager. It helps you focus, ignore distractions, and make better decisions when you need to. There are lots of theories about how this manager works, but a common idea is that it gets cues. Sometimes these cues are obvious, like when someone tells you to pay attention. Other times they're more subtle. Like a pattern, you start to notice. One way we might learn is through episodic binding. Imagine your brain creating a little memory file for each event, including how much effort it took. If you encounter a similar event later, your brain might pull up that old file and use the same level of effort. Another idea is incremental learning, where your brain slowly picks up on longer-term patterns in your environment. For example, if you are often in situations where you need to focus a lot, your brain might gradually start to ramp up your control settings in general. To study this, the researchers used the classic psychology experiment called the Stroop task. You've probably seen it. Words like red, blue, or green are shown in different colored ink. Your job is to say the color of the ink, not the word itself. It sounds simple, but it is surprisingly hard. When the ink color matches the word, it is easy. When it doesn't, like the word red written in blue ink, your brain has to work harder to ignore the word and focus on the ink color. This extra effort is what they called conflict. Now, here is where things get interesting. Some earlier studies tried to see if people could learn to predict when this conflict was coming. For example, they'd show participants a color on one trial, and then the next trial would be either easy or difficult. The idea was that if the color reliably predicted difficulty, people would learn to prepare themselves. But surprisingly, many studies found that people weren't very good at this. They struggled to learn from these previous cues, especially when those cues were just simple colors. The researchers in this paper wondered why people struggled. Was it that people just couldn't prepare for effortful tasks in general, or was it that they couldn't learn to connect a cue, like a color, with the idea of needing more control? To find out, they decided to flip the script. Instead of seeing if a color could predict a difficult Stroop trial, they asked if the difficulty of a Stroop trial could predict the color of the next trial. So, if a trial was easy, congruent, maybe the next trial would be a specific color. If a trial was hard, incongruent, maybe it would be a different color. They set it up so that 80% of the time, the congruency of one trial would reliably predict the color of the next. They wanted to see if people could learn this pattern. They ran 4 experiments to test this. In the first 2, participants weren't told about the pattern. The idea was to see if they would pick it up naturally. In experiment 3, they were told about the pattern to see if explicit instructions helped. And in experiment 4, they made the pattern even stronger by having each level of difficulty predict only one specific color, making the link much clearer. And the results, well, it wasn't what they hoped for. Across the board, they found that people really struggled to learn this new pattern. They didn't get faster on trials that were supposed to be predictable. It seemed like even when the difficulty of the task itself was supposed to be a cue, people couldn't use it effectively to prepare for what was coming next. In experiment 1, they did see a tiny hint that maybe people were slightly faster on valid trials, meaning trials where the previous trial's difficulty did predict the color. But the effect was super small, and when they ran experiment 2 with a much bigger group of people, that hint disappeared completely. Experiment 2, with over 100 participants, was designed to be more robust. But in that study, there was no significant difference in reaction times between trials that were supposed to be predictable and those that weren't. This really cast doubt on whether people were learning the connection at all. So, they tried telling people about the pattern directly in experiment 3. Hey, if the last trial was hard, the next one will be blue, 80% of the time. You'd think knowing this would help, right? But no, it still didn't make a clear difference. Participants didn't speed up in the predictable situations. Then they made the pattern even more obvious in experiment 4, where each level of difficulty predicted just one specific color. Again, no clear benefit. It seemed like no matter how they structured it, people just weren't picking up on these cues related to task difficulty. So, in their interim discussion, the authors say that this consistent lack of evidence suggests that maybe people are generally bad at using abstract information about control demands to predict things in the future. It is not that they can't prepare for difficult tasks, but that they can't easily learn from cues telling them when those difficult tasks are coming, especially when those cues are tied to the task's own difficulty. They also look to see if maybe people just needed more time. Perhaps learning these patterns takes a while, and maybe it would show up in the later parts of the experiment. They split the experiments into a first half and a second half, and while people did get generally faster with practice, there wasn't a strong pattern of learning the predictability in the later stages. Only in one experiment did they see a slight hint of this, but it wasn't a robust finding. But then the researchers got a bit more creative. They started thinking about how our memories work. What if, instead of learning a general rule, people were just remembering specific past experiences? This is called episodic binding. Imagine your brain remembers a specific instance. Okay, an incongruent trial was followed by a red color. If that exact sequence happens again, your brain might retrieve that memory and make it easier to respond. They looked at their data to see if this episodic matching was happening. Did people respond faster when the exact sequence of congruency and color repeated from a previous experience? And guess what? They found a surprisingly strong effect here. Participants did respond faster when the congruency color sequence matched the recent memory. This episodic matching effect was pretty consistent across experiments. It means that when a specific combination of difficulty and color repeated, people performed better. This suggests that at least some learning was happening. But it was more about remembering specific past events rather than learning a general rule about how difficulty predicts color. Interestingly, this memory effect was strongest for the immediately preceding trial. If a specific sequence repeated right after it happened, that is when people saw the biggest benefit. If the repetition happened a few trials later, the effect became much weaker. This suggests that our immediate past experiences have a stronger influence than older ones, which makes sense intuitively. So what does all this mean? The main takeaway is that people really struggle to learn to use the difficulty of a task as a cue to predict future stimuli. They couldn't reliably learn these congruency color associations. This challenges some broader theories of cognitive control that suggest we're always learning and adapting our control settings based on environmental cues. It seems like encoding abstract concepts like cognitive control demand and linking them to specific external cues is a real challenge. The researchers suggest that maybe it is because our working memory is already full with other tasks, like just figuring out how to respond, leaving less room to learn these new abstract connections. And since they didn't see much learning even when they told people the rule or made the rule stronger, it points to a more fundamental difficulty in learning this specific type of association. The finding about episodic matching is really important though. It suggests that even if we can't learn general rules, we can remember specific sequences of events. This episodic replay might be how we adapt by recalling past experiences. But, and this is a big but, they also noted that this effect might be partly due to simple repetition priming. If the same colors appeared in a row, that could also speed things up, and it is hard to completely separate that from true episodic memory. The study also points out that single-session experiments might not be enough for some types of learning. Real-world learning often happens over days or weeks, and the short time between trials might not give our brains enough time to process and learn these complex relationships. So, what is the big picture? It seems our brains are pretty good at learning simple associations like, this color means press this button. But when it comes to using the difficulty or the effort involved in a task as a cue to predict future events, we're not as adept. We seem to rely more on remembering specific past sequences of events, which is a form of learning, but perhaps not the kind of broad, strategic learning that some theories of cognitive control suggest. This suggests that strategies that rely on predicting and preparing for upcoming task difficulty based on simple cues might not be as effective as we thought, at least within the confines of a typical lab experiment. Future research could explore these ideas with longer training periods or different types of cues. What do you think? Does this resonate with your own experiences? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed breaking down this cool research, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.